Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
It's great to be here.
Today, we're stripping away the stained glass and the hymns, and we are looking at the raw, often bloody machinery underneath.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
We're diving into a premise that is as high stakes as it gets. The idea that humanity created God not out of love, but, well, out of fear.
And that religion started as a survival tool, but then it mutated. It became a weapon of control.
And this is the heavy part, that religious violence isn't a glitch in the system. The argument is that it's a structural feature of dogmatic belief.
That is the core argument, yes. We're exploring the book Din Zulfidet, which translates to Religious Violence by Farhan Erkin. And you're right, this isn't theology. It's more of a sociological autopsy of terror committed in the name of the divine.
And I think we should give a heads up to you listening. This source material, it was published in 1997, and it takes a very hard, very materialist look at faith.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to challenge a lot of assumptions about why we believe what we believe.
Which is why we're doing this.
Exactly. Erkin's mission in this text is to prove that religion arises from social crisis. It fills a void. But because dogmas are frozen in time and society is always moving forward,
There's friction.
and that friction, he says, causes fire.
Before we get into the origins of that fire, we have a quick request for everyone listening. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Yeah, it really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
Okay, so let's do it.
Now, back to the very beginning. The text poses a question that really haunts the entire book. Where did the concept of God actually come from?
Right, because if you're a believer, the answer is revelation. God spoke to us. But Erkin comes at it from the complete opposite direction, that we invented God.
And he starts with what he calls the childhood phase of humanity.
What does he mean by that?
Well, picture early humans. I mean, they are completely vulnerable. You've got predators, lightning storms, disease, starvation.
With zero control over anything.
Nothing. And Erkin argues that religion is born from that exact feeling of helplessness. It's a coping mechanism. You know, when you're a terrified child, you need a parent.
So humanity projects a kind of super parent into the sky to make the world feel less terrifying,
Yeah.
more manageable.
Precisely. But the text gets really specific about the mechanics of this. It introduces something he calls the dream theory to explain where the idea of the soul comes from.
I found this part fascinating. The idea is that early humans they didn't understand the biology of sleep.
Not at all. I mean, think about it from their perspective. You go to sleep in your cave, your body is heavy, it's not moving, but in your dream.
You're hunting a mammoth.
Yeah.
Or talking to your ancestor who died last year.
Exactly. So for the primitive mind, there's a duality. There has to be. There's the body that stays put, and there's a double, a spirit that leaves and travels.
And if that double can leave my body while I'm asleep and come back.
Then it stands to reason it can survive when your body dies for good.
That's the spark.
That's the spurk. That's the birth of the soul. And from there, the afterlife. But here's the crucial sociological leap Erkin makes. It doesn't just stop with the individual.
The Gillan needs protection too.
Right. So they take this idea of spirit energy and they project it onto an object, a totem.
Like a wooden pole, an animal carving.
Anything. The totem becomes the collective soul of the group. It defines who we are versus who they are. And this right here is where the danger starts.
Because at first it's just a tool.
A tool for social cohesion, social glue to keep the group from killing each other.
But tools are supposed to serve the user, not the other way around.
And that's the tragedy Erkin highlights. Over time, the tool became the master. The preservation of the totem, or later, the God, became more important than the lives it was invented to protect.
And that shift is where the violence really starts to creep in. Speaking of shifts, the text then moves from this psychological origin into a really gritty economic analysis of the big monotheistic religions.
Yes, and this is where the debate in the text really sharpens. Erkin doesn't treat Christianity or Islam as, divine interventions. He treats them as social solutions to economic disasters.
Let's break down his analysis of Christianity first. He places it right in the middle of the Roman Empire, and he focuses specifically on slavery.
It's a bleak picture. You have this huge population of slaves living in just absolute misery. Now, humans will always try to solve their problems. First, they try what Erkin calls objective solutions.
Real-world actions, revolt.
Exactly. Spartacus, trying to physically break the chains.
But the Romans crushed those revolts brutally.
Totally. They failed. So now you have a population in utter despair. The objective solution is off the table.
So they turn to a subjective solution.
Precisely. If you can't change your reality, you change how you think about your reality. And right then, Christianity comes along with a narrative flip. You are suffering now, yes, but the last shall be first. Your reward isn't here, it's in heaven.
It's a survival mechanism for the mind. It keeps people from going insane in a hopeless situation.
Yes, it's an opium, in the classic Marxian sense, a painkiller. But it's born from the failure of political action.
And he applies a very similar materialist lens to the rise of Islam in the 7th century. He talks about the Ghazu economy.
Right. The Arabian Peninsula back then was an incredibly harsh environment. Resources were scarce. The text describes a society based on Gaz raiding. Tribes would just raid each other to survive. It was pure chaos.
The kill-or-be-killed economy.
And Erkin argues Islam arose as this unifying force to organize that chaos. It took all that raiding energy and just pointed it outward. Instead of tribes fighting each other for scraps, they were united under one god to conquer and distribute resources on a massive scale.
So it wasn't just a spiritual revelation, it was a socio-economic reorganization.
It saved that society from destroying itself.
It's fascinating how in both cases the divine steps in to solve a very messy human crisis. But let's pivot to the title of the book. Religious violence, we have the origins. Now let's talk about the blood. How does he actually define terror?
He goes much broader than how we use the word today. He defines it using two key concepts: the static and the dynamic.
Okay, let's unpack those.
Imagine society as a river. It flows, it changes, it discovers new things, that the earth is round, that germs cause disease. That is the dynamic. Life is always moving forward.
And religion.
Dogmatic religion is a dam. It's the static. By definition, a dogma says, this is the one truth. It was true 2,000 years ago. It's true today. It cannot change.
So you have an unstoppable forced social evolution hitting an immovable object.
And that collision is violent. Erkin says terror is the method the static uses to try and stop the dynamic. It's the institution trying to freeze time by killing the people moving the clock forward.
The book gives some chilling historical examples. One that stood out to me was the Sicarii. I hadn't even heard of them before.
They're a perfect example of what he calls bottom-up terror. This was a Jewish sect in the 1st century, around 66 AD. The Romans were occupying Judea, and some of the Jewish priesthood were seen as collaborators.
So the Sicarii felt the faith was being polluted.
And they took matters into their own hands, literally. They carried small daggers called sikai under their cloaks. They'd walk into a crowded market, blend in, and then stab.
Wow.
They would murder fellow Jews they saw as traitors, then just melt back into the screaming crowd.
It's remarkably similar to modern lone wolf tactics. Create panic to enforce purity.
Exactly. But then you have the flip side. Top-down terror. The Inquisition. This wasn't rebels in a crowd. This was the full machinery of the state.
The details in the text about the Inquisition are just gruesome. The water torture, the thumb screws. But what's terrifying isn't just the pain, it's the logic behind it.
That is the deep dive insight here. Erkin points out that the Inquisitors didn't see themselves as villains. They truly believed that pain saves the soul.
So by torturing you, they're doing you a favor.
A huge favor, saving you from an eternity in hell. Which just goes to show, if you believe in a God that demands absolute purity, you can justify any atrocity.
It completely overrides basic human empathy.
Completely. And we see this so clearly in the text's discussion of the witch hunts. Erkin frames this as a massive misogynistic war on women, specifically women who held knowledge.
Right, these weren't just random women. They were healers, midwives.
They were the dynamic element in their villages. They knew about herbs, anatomy. They held authority outside the church. And the static cannot tolerate a rival authority.
So they burned them.
The text mentions 100,000 victims in the German hunts alone. It was a terror campaign to ensure the only source of truth was the priest.
This brings us to the central conflict of the book, the war on thinking, the believer versus the thinker.
This is where Erkin really hones in on the clash between science and dogma. He says it plainly. Religion recognizes neither opposition nor opposition parties. It demands submission.
But the scientific mind demands questions.
Which leads us to the martyrs of thought. Let's talk about Giordano Bruno. His story is just, it's brutal.
He was executed in 1600, and his crime.
He looked at the night sky and said, the universe is infinite. He argued the stars were other suns with their own planets.
Something that seems completely obvious to us now.
But to the church, it was a death sentence. Think about it. If the universe is infinite, where is heaven? Where is God's throne? It completely destabilized their map of reality.
And the text describes his execution so vividly. They tied his tongue so he couldn't speak to the crowd.
They were terrified of his words, terrified of the dynamic, terrified that if people started thinking about an infinite universe, the finite power of the church would just crumble.
There's another figure mentioned who isn't a scientist, but a mystic, Halaji Mansour. He posed a different kind of threat.
Yes, from the Islamic tradition, Mansour was executed for saying, "An el-Haq, I am the truth."
I am God.
He claimed that God wasn't some king in the sky, but a presence inside the human heart.
Why is that so dangerous? It sounds beautiful.
It's dangerous to the institution. If God is inside you, you don't need the imam, you don't need the building, you don't need the tithes.
You make the whole external structure obsolete.
And so the hierarchy killed him. It just reinforces Orkin's point. The institution will always, always choose its own survival over the truth.
So let's bring this into the modern era. The book was written in the late 90s, looking at the rise of fundamentalism. And Erkin asks the big question, why? We have science now. Why is religious violence still a thing?
And this is where the analysis circles back to sociology. Erkin argues you can't understand modern terror just by reading scripture. You have to look at poverty.
He calls terror a scream of the marginalized.
Yeah. Imagine you're living in a society where the dynamic, the modern world, has left you behind. No job, no political voice, no dignity. The objective solutions of democracy or socialism are blocked by corruption or dictators.
So just like the Roman slaves, you retreat to a subjective solution.
Exactly. You retreat into a radical, simplified version of faith that gives you an identity. It tells you you aren't a poor, unemployed nobody. You are a holy warrior. It restores your pride.
But the text also points a finger at the ruling classes, that they often nudge people in that direction.
This is critical. We have to talk about the Greenbelt Project mentioned in the source. This was a Cold War strategy.
Against Soviet communism.
Right. The West and local elites were terrified of communism, which is atheistic and focuses on class struggle. So what's the best antidote to a godless ideology?
A godly one.
A very godly one. The strategy was to fund and support religious fundamentalism to act as a greenbelt, a buffer against the Soviets. They thought they could use the static to stop the Red Menace,
But they created a monster they couldn't control.
a monster that eventually turned its guns on them. Erkin argues that the violence of the 90s groups like the GIA in Algeria, the IBDAC in Turkey, was the direct fallout of this cynical strategy.
So if we synthesize all this, Erkin's ultimate conclusion is that fighting terrorism with guns is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
He is very firm on this. You can't just kill the mosquito to cure malaria. You have to drain the swamp.
The bomber is just the symptom.
Correct. If you want to stop religious violence, you have to treat the disease. And the disease isn't God. The disease is poverty, inequality, a lack of education. As long as there is despair, people will find a weapon. Religion just happens to be a very powerful one.
Which leads to his strong defense of secularism, laiklik, as it's called in Turkish. He doesn't see it as just a political preference.
No, not at all. For Erkin, secularism is a survival treaty. In a world full of different static beliefs, different gods, the only way we don't kill each other is if the public sphere remains neutral.
It's the referee that keeps the game from turning into an all-out brawl.
Precisely. The moment the state picks a team, it makes everyone else a second-class citizen. That breeds resentment, and that resentment breeds terror. Secularism is the only mechanism that allows the dynamic to function without bloodshed.
It is a heavy, very sobering analysis. It forces you to look at history not as this parade of progress, but as a constant, brutal struggle.
A struggle between the need to control and the need to know. And that struggle is far from over. The names of the groups change, the names of the guys might change, but that core conflict,
The static versus the dynamic.
it's still the central engine of our history.
Before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought from the text. Erkin references that famous quote by Pastor Niemöller about the Nazis. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out.
Because I was not a communist, then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out.
The text uses this to challenge us. In a world where dogma often demands silence, where questioning the static is dangerous, at what point does your silence become complicity?
When you see the river being dammed, do you just stand there and watch? Or do you speak? That's the question every individual has to answer.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.